I filed for divorce on a morning in late May when the lilacs were bloating the air with sweetness so thick it made me nauseous. I'd been living at Mateo's for 9 weeks by then, sleeping on a pull-out couch that groaned every time I shifted, waking to the sound of his espresso machine hissing at 5:30 a.m. He never asked when I was leaving. He just made extra coffee and left it on the counter in the mug that said "World's Okayest Brother," which our sister Luce had given him as a joke a decade ago. Claudia didn't contest it. Osterman referred me to a family attorney named Singh, a brisk woman in her 60s who'd handled 1,000 divorces and had the emotional range of a TSA agent. She asked if there were children, property, or significant assets. I said no, no, and not anymore. She said we could do uncontested no fault, file jointly, be done in 6 months. I asked what it would cost. She said 1,500 if Claudia cooperated. I wrote the check that day, watching my bank balance drop below 4 figures for the first time since I was 25. Claudia signed the papers at a Starbucks on Route 3, neutral ground, mid-afternoon on a Wednesday, when I knew she'd be off work, except she wasn't working anymore. She'd been terminated from Meridian the same day Derek was, escorted out by HR with a box of personal items and a severance check that didn't clear because the company clawed it back for restitution. She showed up in a denim jacket I didn't recognize, her hair pulled into a braid. No makeup. She looked younger and older at the same time. We sat across from each other at a corner table. I slid the papers over. She read through them slowly, lips moving slightly, and when she got to the section about asset division, what little there was, she looked up and said, "You're being fair." I said, "I'm being done." She signed. Her hand shook on the last page. I asked if she had a pen. She'd forgotten one. I gave her mine, a cheap Bic I'd gotten free from the garage supply company. She clicked it twice before the ink started. When she finished, she said, "Gabriel, I stood up. I said, "Don't." I took the papers, left the pen, and walked out into the parking lot where the heat was shimmering off the asphalt in waves. The divorce finalized in November, the week before Thanksgiving. Singh called to tell me the judge had signed off. No ceremony, no final hearing, just a phone call and a PDF in my email. I was under a Dodge Caravan at the time, replacing a rusted exhaust pipe, and I had to crawl out and wipe my hands on a rag before I could open the attachment on my phone. Mateo asked if I wanted to go out and celebrate, maybe get drunk, maybe pick a fight in a bar like we used to in our 20s. I said no. I went back to work. That night I drove to the apartment, my new apartment, a studio in North Bergen with a kitchenette and a window that faced a parking garage, and I sat on the floor because I hadn't bought furniture yet, and I cried for the first time since the subpoena. Not because I missed Claudia, because I missed the version of myself that had believed in her. The criminal case against Claudia moved faster than I expected. The AG's office, bolstered by Derek's cooperation and the evidence Osterman had helped Meridian compile, offered her a plea deal in late June. Osterman recommended she take it. 1 count of wire fraud, probation, restitution, no prison. Claudia's public defender, she couldn't afford private counsel, agreed. The sentencing hearing was in August, held in a federal courtroom in Newark that smelled like floor wax and recycled air. I didn't attend, but Mateo did, curious and protective in equal measure. He called me after. He said Claudia had read a short statement, apologizing to the court and to the victims, which I guess included the insurance companies and maybe Meridian shareholders, though it was hard to think of faceless corporations as victims. The judge gave her 2 years probation, 200 hours community service, and ordered $53,000 in restitution to be paid jointly with Derek. Since Derek had declared bankruptcy, that meant Claudia would be paying it alone in installments for the next decade. Mateo said she looked small in the courtroom, like she'd been folded in on herself. I asked if she'd seen him there. He said no. He'd sat in the back. I thought that would be the end of it. Divorce finalized, criminal case resolved, everyone moving on with diminished lives. But Derek wouldn't let it rest. In September, his attorney filed a counterclaim in the Meridian civil suit, alleging that Claudia had been the primary architect of the fraud and that Derek had been coerced into participating under threat of her reporting a fabricated sexual harassment claim. It was scorched earth desperation, the kind of move you make when you've got nothing left to lose. Osterman called me furious. He said Derek's counterclaim was legally frivolous, but would drag the case out another year and cost Meridian more in legal fees, which meant they might try to squeeze Claudia harder on restitution to offset costs. I said, what can we do? He said, we bury him. Osterman, who'd developed a personal hatred for Derek by this point, I think because Derek reminded him of his own ex-brother-in-law, a con man who'd stolen from Osterman's sister, started digging deeper. He hired a private investigator, a retired cop named Dabrowski, who specialized in employment misconduct. Dabrowski pulled Derek's entire work history, phone records, emails, HR complaints. What he found was a pattern. At his previous job in Pennsylvania, 2 women had filed internal complaints about Derek, one for unwanted advances, one for pressuring her to approve questionable billing. Both complaints had been settled quietly with NDAs and small payouts. At the job before that, in Maryland, a female subordinate had quit abruptly and later sued for constructive dismissal. That case also settled. Derek had spent 15 years moving from company to company, leveraging his position over younger women, usually women in precarious financial situations, and the companies had enabled him by paying settlements and writing neutral references. He was a predator with a briefcase. Osterman filed an amended complaint on behalf of Meridian, adding claims for fraudulent misrepresentation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and attached Dabrowski's findings as exhibits. He also reached out to Derek's ex-wife, the one who'd filed the restraining order. She agreed to provide an affidavit describing Derek's pattern of manipulation and financial control during their marriage. It wasn't directly relevant to the fraud case, but it painted a picture. Osterman sent everything to Derek's attorney with a cover letter that basically said, "Drop the counterclaim or we'll make this public and introduce the harassment pattern at trial." Derek folded. His attorney withdrew the counterclaim in October, and Derek agreed to pay his share of the restitution, whatever he could scratch together post-bankruptcy, which wasn't much, but it was symbolic. More importantly, Meridian agreed to a consent judgment that specified Derek as the primary wrongdoer and Claudia as a subordinate who'd acted under coercion. It wasn't a full exoneration. Claudia had still committed fraud, but it was a narrative correction. Osterman called to tell me the news. I was installing a lift in the new garage, bolting the hydraulic columns into the concrete floor, and I had to step outside to hear him over the noise. He said, "We got him. He's done." I asked what it meant for Claudia. He said, "It means she can rebuild. Slowly, but she can." I didn't call Claudia to tell her. I figured Osterman or her public defender would handle that. But 2 days later, she texted me. First message in 4 months. It said, "Thank you for not letting him destroy me." I stared at it for a long time, sitting in my truck in the garage parking lot after closing. I typed and deleted 3 responses. Finally, I wrote back, "I didn't do it for you. I did it because he deserved it." She didn't reply. Thanksgiving came. Mateo invited me to his place. Luce was flying in from Oregon with her husband and their 2 kids. I hadn't seen them in over a year. Mateo's apartment was loud and warm, full of cooking smells and children shrieking, and Luce hugging me hard enough to crack ribs. Over dinner, turkey and a rose con gandules and flan that Luce's husband made from our grandmother's recipe, Luce asked how I was doing. Not performatively, not polite small talk, but really asking. I said, "Better." She said, "Better than what?" I said, "Better than I was." She squeezed my hand. Later, after the kids were asleep and we were doing dishes, Mateo asked if I regretted any of it. Protecting Claudia, going after Derek, burning a year of my life on someone else's wreckage. I said, "I regret trusting her. I don't regret the rest." He nodded. He said, "You're not the same as you were." I asked if that was good or bad. He said, "Neither. Just true." I saw Claudia one last time, a month after Thanksgiving. I was picking up supplies at a hardware store in Paramus, and I saw her through the window of the Target across the parking lot. She was stocking shelves in the home goods section, wearing a red polo and khakis, her hair back in the same braid. I stood there watching for a minute, holding a bag of concrete mix, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, not even curiosity. just a distant recognition, like seeing someone you used to know in a photograph. I got in my truck and drove back to the garage. By spring, I'd built something sustainable. The garage wasn't profitable yet. I was barely breaking even after rent and equipment leases. But I had regular clients, word-of-mouth referrals, a reputation for honest work. I hired a part-time helper, a kid named Ernesto, who was studying mechanical engineering at community college and needed hands-on hours. He reminded me of myself at that age, hungry to learn, careful with tools, respectful of the craft. I started teaching him diagnostic work, how to listen to an engine, how to trace electrical faults. It felt good to pass something on. I started sleeping better. The nightmares stopped, dreams where I'd open our apartment door and find Claudia and Derek sitting at the kitchen table, laughing, the subpoena burning in the sink. I stopped checking my phone every hour for messages from lawyers or unknown numbers. I stopped flinching every time I saw a silver Honda, which is what Derek drove. I started cooking again, simple meals, and I'd eat them standing at my kitchenette counter watching the parking garage across the street fill and empty with the rhythms of other people's lives. In June, a year after the subpoena, I went back to St. Augustine's for the first time since the wedding. I'm not religious, never have been, went through the motions for Claudia's family, but I needed a place that felt permanent, that had witnessed promises and still stood. I sat in the back pew during evening mass, listening to the priest talk about forgiveness and grace, and I thought about Claudia. Not with longing, not with bitterness, just with a kind of tired clarity. She'd made a choice to betray me, and I'd made a choice to protect her anyway. Not from consequences, but from total destruction. I didn't think that made me noble. I thought it made me someone who still believed, despite everything, that people were more than the worst thing they'd done. But belief doesn't mean reconciliation. It just means you refuse to let someone else's failures turn you into something you're not. After Mass, I walked down to the Brazilian restaurant where we'd met, which was still there. Same owner, same chipped tile floor. I sat at the bar and ordered a caipirinha, which I hadn't had in years. It tasted like lime and sugar and regret. The bartender, an older guy with tattooed forearms, asked if I was celebrating something. I said, "Just remembering." He nodded like that made sense. Mateo calls every Sunday. Lucy emails articles about small business grants and local mechanic unions. I'm building a life that doesn't require anyone's approval or partnership. I date occasionally, cautious, slow, no one serious. I'm not ready for that, maybe won't be for years. But I'm not bitter. I watch couples in diners, hands across the table, and I don't feel envy or anger. I feel something closer to hope, distant and abstract, like a light on the other side of a bridge I'm not ready to cross yet. Derek disappeared from my radar. Last I heard from Osterman, he'd moved to Florida, working some sales job, still dodging restitution payments. Claudia's still in Paramus as far as I know. We exist in separate orbits now. Two people who once built a life together and then dismantled it with lawyers and paperwork and signatures on dotted lines. I think about the version of me that caught the water glass in that restaurant 13 years ago. The one who thought love was enough if you worked hard and stayed honest. I don't mourn him exactly, but I acknowledge the distance. I'm harder now, more guarded, less willing to assume good faith. But I'm also more certain of myself, of my own integrity, of the boundaries I won't cross even when crossing them would be easier. That certainty cost me a marriage, $40,000 and a year of sleep. But it's mine. No one can take it. The garage is quiet on Sunday mornings. I go in anyway, do inventory, clean tools, tune the radio to the jazz station Mateo got me into. The light comes through the high windows in long slants, catching the dust, and I think, this is enough. Not perfect, not the dream, but enough. I've learned the difference. If you've stayed with me this far, I hope you've found something useful in the mess. A reminder that survival doesn't require revenge, just clarity and the will to rebuild. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is draw a line and stand on the other side of it. People ask me sometimes, other mechanics, guys at the diner, Mateo's friends, "Do you regret getting married?" And I say no. I regret who she became, Or maybe who she always was and I didn't see, but I don't regret the attempt. You can't live afraid of betrayal, or you'll never build anything. You just have to be willing to walk away when the foundation cracks, and you have to believe you can build again. I'm building, slowly, carefully, with my own two hands. The concrete is setting, the walls are going up, and when I'm done, it'll be a place where the only promises that matter are the ones I make to myself, and those I'll keep.